400 years ago, a village by the name of Amsterdam began its mission to conquer the world, invented capitalism as we know it, and became the richest city on the European continent.
There was this sense among the Dutch that whoever you were, you could have a piece of the action. You could be involved in this great economic activity of your society.
100 years later, London, its main rival, took its place. The greatest trading power in the world, London endured terrific hardships, but went on to become the world's largest city and invented the megalopolis of tomorrow's world.
When the railways crashed through the poorer areas of London, people were just dispersed. They were swept aside, you might say.
Meanwhile, New Amsterdam had now become New York. It was under British rule. The city cut itself free and entered the fray. At the outposts of technical revolution, New York became the vertical city and created a whole new horizon for itself.
You watched day by day as this stone structure was being built in the middle of the river, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger.
Le terme de gratte-ciel, en fait, est intéressant parce qu'il renvoie à ce qu'était le paysage urbain de New York, la ville où on invente la notion de silhouette urbaine, de skyline. Le paysage urbain de New York, il était constitué par les clochers des églises et les mâts des navires. Et en haut des navires se trouvait une petite voile triangulaire, la plus haute du bateau, que l'on appelait le skyscraper. C'était la voile qui était la plus proche du ciel.
The City Hall was where New York's skyscraper saga first began. At the end of the 19th century, 3 major newspapers set up their headquarters on either side. The competition between them was fierce. The winner would be the one that went the highest. 1876, the New York Tribune, with its 11 stories, was the tallest building in the world upon its construction. 1889, the Times building to the right was immediately overtaken by the New York World Building and its Golden Dome. The former was 15 stories high. The latter had 19 stories. While its 2 neighbors were built out of brick, it was the first building in New York to have a skeleton made entirely out of steel.
Avec la fonte, on pouvait monter à peu près jusqu'à 15, peut-être 18 étages. Avec l'acier, il n'y a plus de limite. Il n'y a plus de limite. La seule limite est la limite des capitaux du constructeur, puisque les ascenseurs peuvent être répétés et peuvent monter jusqu'au ciel.
15 years later, in the same square home to the City Hall, the Woolworth Building went a step further. ...241 meters, 57 stories. It was Manhattan's first emblematic skyscraper. Not only because it was the highest tower in the city and would remain so for 16 years, but because its style and outline stood out from all those around it. This time, the building wasn't owned by a newspaper, but by one of the richest men of that time. Frank Woolworth was the owner of a chain of single-price shops named after himself. Everything was sold for 5, 10, or 15 cents. And in America, at the start of the 20th century, that was a winning formula. According to Frank Woolworth, The skyscraper's construction was paid for by the little pieces of change accumulated in his shops. In so doing, upon its construction, the Woolworth Building acted as a fantastic publicity stunt for Frank Woolworth himself and his company. But Woolworth and his architect, Cass Gilbert, had another stroke of genius, an homage to Gothic architecture, to European cathedrals.
How is this upstart nation, how is this upstart city going to take its place on the international stage? Well, it's going to do it by looking to the European past, looking to the masters, looking to the cathedrals, looking to the great works of monumental architecture. So when the Woolworth Building is completed in the early 20th century, and it's the tallest building in the world, it's a Gothic cathedral.
When you walk into the Woolworth Building, you're aware of walking into a kind of cathedral-like portal, which is quite monumental, and then into a lobby that makes you feel like you're in a magnificent church, but it's rather scaled down. It's scaled to the human experience.
And the lobby, interestingly enough, has a cruciform shape to it. Suddenly you're in a church, and you recognize that you're in a church, standing in the nave. I mean, you get it with the transept. It comes across. Okay, then you look at some of the decorative features, and you see things that look gargoyle-like. But when you look at it closely, you realize that that's not a griffin or something, that's a person. Okay, who's the person? It's Woolworth. And what's he doing? He's counting nickels and dimes. You look at another one of these gargoyle-like things, you see that it's the architect. He's memorialized himself. And what's he holding? He's holding the building.
The period in which the Woolworth Building was built was met with large waves of immigration into the United States, and therefore the arrival of dozens of thousands of European craftspeople. They were the ones who created the mosaics and decorations in the entrance hall. Here, it is the divinity of work being worshipped. And it's the goddess of trade welcoming a visitor as they enter the skyscraper. The Woolworth Building was just like a church, but it was a church of the New World.
It's not about the power of the king. It's not about reaching up to the heavens for God. It's not about contemplation. It's about rentable space where people are doing really ordinary, boring jobs. And yet, it's a cathedral of commerce. I mean, that is the quintessential New York idea, a cathedral of commerce. Like, it's an oxymoron. And yet, in the hands of a talented architect like Cass Gilbert, the Woolworth Building becomes absolutely seared in your brain as a memorable work of art.
By the time the Woolworth Building opened its doors on the eve of the First World War, New York had found its new dimension. Skyscrapers began sprouting up across Manhattan, giving birth to a new concept, the skyline, the urban silhouette. This landscape soon spread around the world. It was a demonstration of the city's newfound power and its global ambitions. Never in human history had an empire spread so widely. London dominated vast territories across 4 different continents, thus becoming the empire on which the sun never sleeps. The West End, the neighborhood of aristocracy and the upper middle classes, began expanding significantly. But here, the latest additions were not external. These London terrace houses had stayed more or less the same since their initial construction in the 18th century. But now their interiors were beginning to change.
The growth of the terraced house in London coincides with the growth of consumption, of individual families buying things. And if you go back into the sort of 17th century, people didn't have many things in their houses because there weren't many things to buy. But by the Victorian period, the whole notion of shopping and buying furniture, decorative items for your house had exploded. The range of things you could get were absolutely enormous.
This was the first age in which a relatively average person could afford to live in a house that was decorated, that contained apparent carvings and high-quality finishes, because these were able to be mass-produced. Colours were being invented through the invention of new dyes, and so these places became much more colourful. And we were moving from a monochrome society for all bar the very richest through into something where you had very ornate, very colourful interiors in buildings.
And these little terraced houses, as a result, are unique because from the outside, they're very anonymous. Like an English person. No giving away of their character. But the moment you go inside, they were richly and individually furnished based on this extraordinary explosion of shopping and consumption that gripped London in the 19th century.
Such prosperity attracted growing interest. And the population of London tripled between 1850 and 1900, reaching 6 million inhabitants by the turn of the 20th century. The richest city in the world was also rife with inequalities. The poorest people were concentrated to pockets of poverty. No part of the city was spared. It was a time of revolution. It was in London that Karl Marx wrote Das Kapital. In 1886, the West End riots broke out. For 3 days, the violence spread through to the posh neighborhoods. It was at this point that a man named Charles Booth began his great project. To avoid future overcrowding, he thought it would be worth better understanding the population of London.
You have to imagine a typical Victorian businessman, an immensely successful ship owner, came from Liverpool, came from Britain's second largest port in Liverpool. He used statistical analysis of trade flows, of inventories, of prices, and it was through his ability with applied statistics that he made his fortune and built the Booth shipping line into the very successful company that it was.
In the 1880s, Booth moved to London. This time, he'd use his mathematical skills to study the quality of life of the city's inhabitants. It was a huge undertaking, which he funded with his personal fortune.
His teams of investigators went out with policemen. The police were constantly patrolling the streets of London. There was no street which they didn't patrol, and there would be an investigator taking notes, house by house, of the condition of the property and the condition of the residents. And then, in the back room, these data were tabulated and mapped cartographically in these celebrated images of London, coloured in 7 different grades of colour, to give you the social geography of wealth and poverty in London.
Booth's study, published in 1902, is like a snapshot of a huge metropolis in turmoil. Yellow for the wealthy, red for those living comfortably, orange for mixed neighborhoods, light blue for neighborhoods whose inhabitants, albeit poor, had regular income, dark blue for areas where people were in chronic want, and black for those Charles Booth deemed to be vicious and semi-criminal.
Yes, it's true. There was a broad gradient between the east of London, London east of the Tower, and the west end of London. But as soon as you look at the maps, you understand that the social geography is much, much more complex. There were concentrations of deep poverty, very, very close to the beautifully manicured lawns of the Bedford estate. And equally, in the East End of London, there were respectable middle-class families living in the middle of what was caricatured as the jungle of the East End.
In his book, Charles Booth invented the concept of a poverty threshold, below which, he wrote, a third of Londoners were living. 10% of the population of London, he added, had no chance of escaping this fate. Central Park had been finished, but around it, almost nothing else had yet been built. No houses, and certainly no buildings. This neighborhood, now one of the most luxurious in Manhattan, was little more than abandoned lots. So this is where the American economy's new millionaires were able to build their little castles, which were called the mansions. For about 30 years, this part of the city became a playground for all kinds of eccentricities.
There were no more than a dozen or so of these incredibly large mansions, but certainly there were probably 50 to 75 very substantial large houses, mainly on Fifth Avenue, as well as on Park Avenue, and then several hundred more smaller, still substantial houses.
And so New Yorkers nicknamed Fifth Avenue Millionaires' Row. The new residents were men from industries such as railways, steel, coal, oil, or finance. John Rockefeller, who would soon be the richest man in the world. He brought a pre-built house located a stone's throw from Central Park. The interior evoked all styles, all eras, and all continents. Andrew Carnegie, the Prince of Steel. He built his own mansion on a plot spreading half a hectare, which was a considerable plot size for Manhattan. His house is one of the only ones to have survived, alongside that of his business partner, the coal baron Henry Clay Frick.
It was tremendously expensive. Frick spent the equivalent of about $2.8 million to buy all of the lots, and this is a time when there's not a whole lot of other building on Upper Fifth Avenue yet. And then he spent even more, the equivalent of about $3 million to construct this monstrously large palace to live in and then to display his collection of art. It survived precisely because he designed the house to also serve as a museum after his death, and he made sure to leave enough money along with his collection to ensure its survival.
Henry Frick's mansion is an exception, because as soon as the First World War was over, these little palaces belonging to America's wealthiest individuals started to disappear one after the other. In their place, they built much taller buildings, which were incredibly luxurious, but much more profitable and glamorous. The first to be completed was the famous Dakota.
These were palaces in the sky. You'd have a building of 12 or 15 stories that might only have 8 or 10 families living in it. The apartments were usually arranged on multiple stories, what in New York is called a duplex format. So you'd have an interior staircase within the apartment that sort of replicated the feel of living in a multi-story house. In some cases, you might even get a 3-story apartment.
A developer would offer a huge sum of money to the owners of a mansion, which they'd eventually sell, thus giving way to one of these huge buildings. But most of the time, the owners made extra demands. And some demands bent all the rules.
There was a woman named Marjorie Hutton. She was the heiress from a breakfast cereal company from the Midwest, and she was married to an investment banker. They had built a mansion for themselves on Fifth Avenue. And one day a developer came along and said, we'd like to buy your house and to put up a new building. And she agreed on one condition. And the condition was that she be given a custom-built apartment at the top of the new building. And she was given an apartment that didn't precisely replicate the architecture of her house, but to a certain degree did. She had custom furnishings, rugs, woodwork, other things that were replicated in the new apartment. In addition, she was given her own separate porte-cochere with her own private corridor that connected to her own private elevator that took her straight up to the top of the building, where she enjoyed 3 entire floors to herself in 30,000 square feet. The largest apartment, to my knowledge, that has ever been built in New York City, perhaps anywhere.
Marjorie Hutton's apartment had 54 rooms and no less than 17 bathrooms, a record that's never been beaten in New York, even though several years later, another apartment outdid it through sheer extravagance. Built in the new, very chic Upper West Side neighborhood, it was owned by a man named William Randolph Hearst. He owned the leading media group in the United States, and he was a very original character, to say the least.
He had a 3-story, triple-height living room that was decorated like a Gothic church with imported elements from Europe. And then each room was decorated according to a different theme, again, using imported architectural elements. So a French bedroom and, an Italian study, this, that, and the other.
At that time, the American economy appeared to have no bounds, and the First World War had accelerated the United States' rising power. This neighborhood was the fruit of years of recklessness and excess, which was abruptly put to an end by the Wall Street crash in 1929. Letchworth, 50-odd kilometers to the north of the British capital. While New York was revolutionizing architecture, London was inventing the urban structure of the future. Letchworth is now a cute little suburb of around 35,000 inhabitants. But it was the result of a radical project. A project dreamt up by a man who saw the solution to the city's complex problems in nature. His name was Ebenezer Howard.
He saw the problem of poverty as a byproduct of the city and of density. He wasn't interested in sort of social explanations or economic explanations. It was the city itself that created social struggle and discontent and unhappiness. And nature, the countryside, a better balance between the peace of the countryside, the tranquility of nature, and the economic opportunity of the town could be achieved if you rebuilt the town in nature. This was his big idea, the garden city. This developed into what we call the arts and crafts movement. The arts and crafts movement looked to vernacular cottages of the English countryside. The half-timbered frontages, the long roofs with their eaves, the gable ends, the open-plan interiors with the inglenook fireplaces. Wonderful, wonderful arts and crafts echoes of medieval building style. This represented a return from the world of industrial production to the world of handicraft, to the imagined equilibrium or utopia of a medieval society in which work would be local, people would make with their own hands.
The Garden City was built on former farming land, which by its very nature was worth practically nothing, but was enhanced by the new settlers. At the center, they established administrative buildings, public services, and businesses. Around these, they built the residential areas, then the industrial areas, then the farming belt. Everything was accessible via a star-shaped network of roads. But Howard saw beyond this and believed that the benefits derived from each garden city would be invested in creating new small towns dotted around London that worked on the same basis. The Garden City would have therefore offered a counter-model to the megalopolis. Ultimately, this approach only worked once. But Howard's invention immediately caught people's imagination and acted as a basis to create from scratch a city.
So this was workers' housing of a very, very different sort. With a garden at the front, a garden at the back, a street verge planted with cherry trees, allotment workers' gardens for growing their own food, set in a small town surrounded by an agricultural belt producing fresh food for the town, owned by the municipality, owned by the people themselves.
At the time, most residents in Letchworth worked within the Garden City. Many of them were employed at the Spirella factory, the biggest one in Letchworth, which was set up inside a very innovatively designed building. Here, most of the workers were women. They manufactured what was very sexy underwear for the early 20th century. Spirella saw itself as a model business, and its employees received far superior perks to the average British worker. On the top floor of the factory, they had their very own space. There, they'd engage in all sorts of activities, gymnastics, gatherings of all kinds, concerts and dancing.
Obviously, like all colonies, they had to attract colonists. And the colonists that they attracted tended to be progressives. They tended to be people who, like Ebenezer Howard, believed in social experiment. So it's in Letchworth Garden City that we see the first extensive experiments in wearing sandals, in dress reform, in vegetarianism, in sleeping out of doors at night. People had bedrooms with overhead gantries in which their bed could be swung out so they could breathe the fresh oxygen.
Straight away, the Letchworth phenomenon, a new city surrounded by nature, started gaining interest beyond England's borders. Paris, Brussels, Berlin, and even Tokyo each in turn tried to develop their own garden cities. London, the first metropolis in history, had just invented its antidote. In the decades that followed, Ebenezer Howard would help transform cities around the world.
By the early 1910s, there really was a new scale for the skyscraper, not just in terms of height, but also in the lot coverage and the girth and the blockiness of buildings that contained an enormous amount of floor space. And the best example of that is the Equitable Building.
164 meters, 44 stories. Nowadays, the Equitable Building is much like dozens of other office buildings in Manhattan. However, New York partially owes the way it looks today to this very building.
Ce qui est remarquable dans le cas de l'Equitable, dont le plan a la forme d'un H, c'est la densité et la rapidité des ascenseurs. C'est une gigantesque machine à faire circuler verticalement les gens.
48 lifts for 50,000 employees. That, now in Manhattan, is quite ordinary. But when it opened in 1915, it was rather revolutionary. The Equitable's neighboring buildings were considerably smaller. And in the narrow roads in South Manhattan, its arrival was not well received.
Depending on the time of the day, almost a 4-block area of lower rise and older buildings had been cast into the shadow of this titanic structure, stealing their light, stealing the value of the sunlight that was used to illuminate the space. Lights at that time, the bulbs of lights burned very hot, and they didn't really give off very much light. So light was a heat generator. Windows had to open in order to ventilate the space. So buildings were much more dependent on natural sunlight and the wind in order to create a habitable workspace.
Manhattan therefore had to find a way of building higher without upsetting neighboring buildings. And it was George Burdett Ford who found the solution. His idea was city planning regulations, which were adopted in 1916, and these were his instructions. First of all, vertically, you could build the equivalent of the width of the street or avenue bordering the building. Then you draw a straight line from the middle of the road. That way, you get a base structure which you can build on, but with setbacks. Depending on the neighborhood, residential or commercial, the main facade would sit at various heights. And one last feature was that on 25% of the plot, you could build as high as you wanted. This was the recipe behind the Empire State Building and hundreds of other skyscrapers in Manhattan.
And although this is purely a sort of technical formula that's about preserving light and air, one of the interesting things is very quickly it helps give shape to a whole new style of architecture in the city, a kind of ziggurat style of architecture.
Those kinds of recessive mountain or cliff-like projections give this very distinctive New York look, the zigzag that really kind of has a jazz age quality, because the way that light and shadow begin to develop in those right-angled spaces get a kind of frenetic energy that you see when you see it in black and white photography and when you see it in shade and shadow in the city.
Many of Manhattan's most famous buildings were the result of the 1916 regulation. They all seem to be part of the same family, and yet they're all different. 120 Wall Street with its stair-like shape. The New York Telephone Building and its unorganized silhouette. The American Radiator Building and its step-back roof. or even the Chrysler Building and its rocket-shaped roof. These were all built within the space of around 15 years. Meanwhile, America was undergoing a period of huge economic growth in the wake of the First World War. Dozens of buildings were now transforming Manhattan's urban skyline, thus making it instantly distinguishable from others.
In the 1920s, the rise of the stock market and the rise of the skyscraper were companions. In fact, you might think of the graph of the rising stock market much like the rising profile of New York's skyline, with peaks and then valleys during times of recession, because skyscrapers are always connected to markets.
With the exception of the Woolworth Building, the number and height of skyscrapers in New York is well married to the growth of Wall Street, but with a slight delay. While the stock market was crashing in autumn 1929, the Chrysler Building was already under construction, and work was just about to begin on the Empire State Building. It was the apotheosis of this era of great skyscrapers. 85 stories, the tallest, the biggest, and the fastest.
The technology of its construction was really not exceptional. The steel skeleton had been used now for almost 20 years. It has a kind of kit of parts of steel beams and columns that are held together by rivets that workers in teams of 5 constructed with the enormous amount of effort and heroism when you see the photographs of the steel workers, and indeed all of the workers on the site. But what was really extraordinary about the Empire State Building was first its scale and then its speed of construction. And really the genius of the Empire State Building was the construction management. In skyscrapers, time is money. You borrow money in order to construct the building, so the shortest amount of time you have that money borrowed, and the quicker that you turn it into rentable space, the more profitable the building will be. And the Empire State Building was built much faster than any skyscraper of its time.
1 story per day, on average, through the summer of 1930. The Empire State's construction took little more than a year. But when it opened, only a quarter of its offices had tenants. The king of buildings had arrived at the wrong time. It would only become profitable 20 years later, long after the Second World War. The Blitz, the intensive bombing of London by the German Air Force. From September the 7th, 1940, every night was a living hell.
London was an unmissable target for the Luftwaffe. It was a target 12 miles across. It is still, you must remember, the largest city in the world. It was bigger than Calcutta at the time. It was a vast target.
Since 1900, London had doubled in size. With its 8 million inhabitants, it was a low-density megalopolis. That was its great strength in this horrific ordeal.
The intense period of the Blitz lasted for a relatively short time between September 1940 and May 1941. In that period, there was bombing every night, 160 bombers on average coming over. The worst night, there was 580 tons of high explosives dropped. 250,000 people were made homeless. Their homes just disappeared.
The psychological effect was enormous. The sirens sounded everywhere. The entire population went down into the shelters. But in fact, in this low-density city, of 8 million people, the impact of bombing was fairly localized. So we can see areas of very, very dense bomb damage side by side with large areas of London where everyday life carried on as normal.
In the first few weeks, London's docks and its industrial districts, as well as the city, its financial core, were targeted as a priority. But over time, the megalopolis was affected as a whole. The Blitz killed 30,000 people. It changed the face of Britain's capital forever.
What is, I think, so important about the history of London has been its ability to renew itself physically. And when we look at the Blitz, we are simply looking at a reprise of what happened when the railways came, what happened when the Great Fire came. It was an opportunity to start again, to revitalize the commercial, economic, financial infrastructure of the city.
At the end of the war, the city was but a shadow of its former self. It had to write itself a new story. It's well known what happened next. The city caught a second wind when Margaret Thatcher deregulated the financial markets. This decision greatly boosted not only activity, but also the planning of the old city of London, the original core around which the English capital had begun expanding in the 17th century. The medieval city, which had become an increasingly specialized business hub, is where the metamorphosis was accomplished.
I became the city planning officer in 1985 as the government was announcing the deregulation of financial services. This meant that the City of London was going to be opened up to competition and that banks from all over the world were going to be able to trade in London. Now we needed to incorporate computer-operated trading on large dealing floors in each of the bank's buildings. That required a very different type of building. And therefore a decision was taken that the city would have to go tall, would have to build skyscrapers. The city needed to go vertically because it could no longer build on any other way.
The influx of financial markets was now growing beyond the city's limits, so London's old docks began changing in appearance. The disused docks were converted into a business hub. They were the pride of London in the 19th century. Abandoned after the Second World War, they'd now found a new use. But the very concept of skyscrapers actually reached beyond the City of London's borders for the first time too. The Shard, 241 meters high, contains offices, but also luxury apartments. It's a new urban trend, one that started in New York, where it's currently changing the city. Of course, since the 1930s and its symbolic buildings, hundreds of glass buildings have been built in Manhattan. But none of them have led us to forget the great starts of its urban skyline. They will always remain iconic New York buildings, objects that form an integral part of its identity. In the future, however, there may be serious challenges. A whole new kind of skyscraper. They're called the super talls. 425 meters, 88 stories high. This one is currently the tallest skyscraper in New York, and it's a luxury residential tower. The super talls are curious yet exquisite objects, whose origin dates back over a century ago to when Cornelius Vanderbilt, the American railway king, decided to build the Grand Central Terminal, the terminus for his railway lines.
Building Services Quito, please report to a Taste of New York personnel.
Grand Central is, above all, a great architectural feat. But here, the real novelty isn't the main concourse. It's the underground platforms and their use, which one of the original engineers came up with.
L'ingénieur William Wilgus, qui est le grand opérateur du chantier de Grand Central, va avoir cette idée géniale de construire sur le vide, c'est-à-dire de créer un quartier nouveau au-dessus des voies de chemin de fer, tout simplement parce que les fondations des immeubles sont réalisées à travers les voies. Le sol est atteint à travers les voies, permettant ainsi à des bâtiments de se dresser sur un sol artificiel. Du coup, les promoteurs qui construisent les bâtiments n'achètent pas un terrain. Ils achètent un volume d'air, la possibilité de construire sur un volume d'air en posant ses fondations au niveau inférieur à travers les voies.
All the big cities in the world now use this method. However, in New York, the concept of air rights developed into something else. Take the famous St. Patrick Cathedral on Fifth Avenue, for example. Since it had no intention of giving way to a skyscraper, it sold a property developer its air rights. In other words, the space above it, which it owned. In exchange for said airspace, it received a small fortune. The same principle applies to all buildings that fall beneath the authorized limit in their district. They can decide not to build on the extra space they're entitled to build in and sell it to a promoter, who can build above the authorized limit elsewhere.
When you sell the air rights, you're selling that unbuilt space to a new developer who then is able to go to the city and said, I bought 20 stories. And literally the developer then gets to add that volume to the volume that he is already able to build. So if he's able to build a 30 or 40 story building and he buys 20 stories from surrounding properties, he's now able to legally build 60 stories.
This concept has now been applied to much bigger skyscrapers. There are customers keen for this new type of tower, and technology has made huge progress.
Engineering today enables you to build incredibly tall on a very small plot of land. So you can buy a plot of land that's 75 feet by 100 feet and build a tremendously tall building. There's really no limit. You could go half a mile high.
The first super tall tower was designed by Christian de Pont-Saint-Parc, a French architect. His apartments are the most expensive ever to be sold in Manhattan.
Views have value, and this is the trophy of the New York apartment, to walk out of the elevator into a domain that belongs to you and you alone, to see this commanding view of the horizon stretching in all dimensions. There is no greater expression of power and possession than a view of Central Park, an exclusive, singular place, even though the singularity of it is repeated 80 times in the sky until you get to the penthouse with all the floors underneath. 157 was reported at just over $100 million. There are others that have sold for $87 million, $90 million, I mean, almost inconceivable amounts.
These new buildings will remain a simple curiosity unless they're multiplied in years to come, revolutionizing New York's urban skyline. A once fairly uniform landscape is giving way to an irregular and chaotic horizon, as an expression of the new financial world behind skyscrapers in Manhattan.
Some of that market demand comes from people who have generated enormous fortunes in countries that have uncertain futures. So you have people with a lot of money from Russia and the Middle East and Asian economies where there's some very, very wealthy people, so they want to invest in New York City real estate. And they're essentially just using those buildings as a place to park their money.
In New York, an era is coming to an end. Soon, the kings of Manhattan will no longer be office buildings, but residential skyscrapers whose apartments are often second homes. Fortunes from around the world will dominate the skyline. It's a strange reverse situation for this city, whose main aim has always been to conquer the world.